What extent do you think the clash between the past and the present within the film may have influenced any creative choices that you made on this project?
It was everything, really. I mean, I think everything in the music came from the story. So certainly from a score point of view, I was looking to kind of have this feeling of the 60s always kind of leaching through into the present day. And then as the present day gets more and more overwhelmed and Ellie's experience gets more extreme, it to feel like almost those 60s things are melting all around her. She has this glorious idea of the 60s being this perfect place, and London being this amazing thing for her, and feeling that all crashing around. Kind of wanted that to be reflected in the music. So as we go through, it gets kind of sort of more distorted, more kind of a messier experience as you get through to the end of the film.
Absolutely. So obviously, having worked with Edgar before, when did you realize this was maybe it feels like a completely different animal from a composition point of view? So at what point did that sort of become apparent to you?
I think just from the earliest conversations with him, it was clear he was looking to do something very different, and his reference points were very, very different for it. And it just felt like an opportunity for us all to kind of press different buttons, really. But whilst building on some of the things we've done before, I mean, there's a lot of techniques that we've built up with the source music, for example, over films like Baby Driver and The World's End, where we will take a song but maybe change its meaning slightly. Maybe the score runs alongside it, and all these things that can just kind of make the film feel like everything's all entwined. A lot of that went into it, but definitely it was a film with more score in it from my point of view. And that meant I started earlier, and we started that collaboration earlier, and there was a lot more back and forth rather than things coming in when the edit was at quite a developed stage. I was giving him music way before they started shooting even. So the music sort of I was writing became part of the tapestry of the whole thing really early on.
I was going to say, beyond, obviously you've got orchestra in there, and you have, I'll see if I can phrase this correctly, you have a recurring piano motif, which goes through it. So from your perspective, apart from those two elements, what other instruments do you think help define the score on this particular film?
I mean, it's definitely a lot more band related things. So there's a lot of guitars, there's a lot of basses, there's a lot of kind of 60s inspired things. There's tape loops were a big part of it, because I was very into that idea of reversed tape loops and things looping through and distorting around. There's a lot of drums, there's a lot of Hammond organ. Certainly in the 60s sort of things, I was extricating things from the idea of those John Barry things. There's a lot of woodwind sort of ensemble stuff. There's kind of strings that are kind of quite small groups of players, but all playing really loud. That sort of feeling of the spirit of some of those recordings. There's a lot of that in there. But then, more in the contemporary side of things, there's quite a lot of synth stuff going on as well. So hopefully they all blend together to make something that sounds really specific to the way his film looks,
Yeah. I was going to say from like the midway point, there seems to be a lot of musical conflict, and I'm going to be a little bit Anaraki and use the word dissonance. I was like, do I use this word? But it actually makes sense, and I think it'll make sense. Obviously, it makes sense to you. So how do you think this succeeds in sort of supporting the creative vision and what Edgar was obviously trying to do?
I think really it's a very experiential film, and you really are sort of taken on a bit of a roller coaster emotion wise, and things get overwhelmed. There were parts we wanted it to feel overwhelming, and that was kind of something we worked on a lot. The film starts very, very sort of quite slowly and intimately, really. It's quite a real life story, and certainly the sound and the music, we were only playing from the very front of the theatre in those bits. We were only using the front speakers. We never used anything in the surround at all until we got to 60s London. Then we opened the whole thing up. And once that world was open, the 60s gradually gets more insane, and the present day kind of the echoes of the 60s get more insane. And so every trick was open to us. So, there's things are massively panned around the room, sort of almost distractingly. So like those old 60s record mixes, where things are sort of insanely wide and flinging about the place.
Because I noticed that, having watched it in 2 theatres now, I picked up more in like a general in like the auditorium last night, rather than actually in the test screening that I went to, and I completely get the whole idea of the soundscape doing that. It's when she comes out of the alley, and you've got the thunderball thing, and it just goes boom. And
and I think we were all keen. You know, Edgar's obviously a massive, you know, supporter of the theatre experience, and we definitely entered these films sort of, you know, it's designed to be a cinema film, and so we use every device open to us. And as things get further onto the thing, we do, you know, there's a lot of dissonance in the music, there's a lot of sound design, there's a lot of processed stuff going on with voices. You know, there's a lot of in the music track I was using a lot of I would extricate kind of specific lines of dialogue from the 60s and kind of echo them through into the future in that way. You know, they're becoming, you can't almost tell what they are, but because they've been so, time has kind of damaged them over the 50, 60 intervening years or whatever, but they're all part of the rhythm of life, you know. So there were a load of those sort of ideas that came out of the writing of the film that helped me with the music.
I was going to say, so to what extent do you think your subversion, I use the word subversion of the 60s standards in this score sort of extended the broader narrative?
Sorry, say again.
So
I lost
it's more in reference to the use of this. I was looking at the score, like the Cilla Black song, and also the Sandie Shaw song, which are on the soundtrack itself, and how you sort of meld yourself in with that particular song, those particular songs.
I think both those are really good examples of what you can do with songs. You know, there's a tradition, I think, in films where the song is planted in, and that is it. It's like this sort of sacred object, and you're kind of using the reference points people have got around this song, but you kind of don't go any further than that. And there was something really interesting about taking a happy-go-lucky kind of sounding song, like Always Something There to Remind Me, and sort of pulling out all the darkness of it and kind of turning it into something else. And that was a sequence I was very much inspired by, you know, Revolution 9, the Beatles track, you know, which I had the White Album on in the car, and my kids had heard it for the first time ever. It's still the most terrifying bit of music in the world, frankly. And, you know, and there's all these things coming from different places, and they're all slightly disconnected, but somehow this mood, this darkness comes out of the whole thing. Absolutely. And the idea of taking something, you know, as innocent as that, the Sandie Shaw track, you know, and the all that sort of jaunty business. And then gradually it starts to, you know, and the orchestra takes over, and a vocal line will suddenly be looped around and becomes this sinister thing. Absolutely. Things like that helped us sort of, you know, it's making a nightmare out of the image of the 60s. And that was a fun thing to play with musically. Same thing with the You're My World, you know, which we re-recorded in a couple of different ways with Anya Taylor-Joy singing, who also sings all the way through the score. And again, it just sort of recontextualizes that song and makes it a real part of the storytelling in a way that I think's a really interesting way to work. So,
so what degree do you think the musical scores can influence a film classification? So, I'm talking the fact that this film's got an 18 certificate, and I've had conversations with my other half on this, because she saw it with me last night. And had I not known that it had that, I didn't know it when I went to see the test screening. And I wonder to what extent, obviously you're talking about the darkness that the score brings in and how it influences the mood of the film. So just more on a general level, how do you think film scores can influence films in terms of what classification they get?
I think they can certainly sort of enhance mood, and they can elevate the mood. I think with things like classifications, a lot of that can come down to the technical side of things, of how many seconds a shot is shown for, and how many words are used that you know can be deemed offensive in certain ways, and you know there's complications along those sort of lines. But I mean, the music's always there to heighten the emotion for me, and you know certainly in something which has got kind of horror things going on, we were very aware through the working of the film of how we were working some of those scares, and how, you know, how we could make them feel the most effective, and kind of ramping up that tension as you got through the film, and not going too big too soon, and maybe subverting some of them, and not necessarily hitting a shock in a big way, but hitting it in a sort of a withdrawn sort of way. So yeah, I mean, I think it's the whole thing comes together, and you know the censors make of it what they will.
So
out of interest, did you think the 18 was
justified? I tell you, I don't think so. I think maybe like a hard 15 would have probably been more in line. I mean, I understand with obviously the violence and the blood and I think it's more to do with the underlying themes and the mood which comes through and as it gets darker and it gets darker. So I don't maybe prolonged threat, because at the beginning of it says for extreme gore, and there is, but it's sort of a B-movie slasher gore rather than
it's quite sort of stylized, isn't it, when it does get gory.
Yeah, so yes and no. I think it probably could have got a 15 if truth be told. I've seen much worse things which didn't get that certificate. So I think that might limit the audience, if anything, which is a shame.
No, I was a little surprised, but
it is what it is. Which sort of leads me to the next question. So from your perspective, would you consider this a horror film in the classic sense, or just a film with horrific elements to it?
I think it's an Edgar Wright film, and it plays with genre, and it very much it's very literate cinematically, and it's I think it plays with all of those things and becomes its own sort of ride. And I think sometimes embracing that ride is the fun part of seeing these films, rather than I kind of find it hard to classify this film and a lot of Edgar's films, because they're very, he has his own language that he's developing with each film. And to me, the exciting thing is, this is very different from the one before, which was very different from the one before that. And how fantastic we've got someone in this country doing that, and, really playing with genre and challenging himself to do different things. I just can't wait to see what he does next, really.
See, I was one thing I listened to I listened to another score from another film after I'd listened to yours extensively. I went to The Shining. I don't know whether that was the right thing to do, but there were little bits and pieces where you've got the orchestra and you use like individual instruments in the same sort of way that in that film. So
well, The Shining was definitely on our list of, again, as a mood thing. Things like Don't Look Now as well was something that, Edgar's a huge fan of that film, and I've watched it many times through that influence. And there is something about the mood of those sort of 60s, 70s kind of pieces that there is that build-up of tension, and there is that sort of, and musically there's often one or two elements that just sort of just do enough to kind of keep pulling you in. And it's a fascinating thing, the psychology of those things and the sound of them as well. Obviously they're period scores now, and so they have that kind of a very people playing in the room sound. There's a woodiness to the sound, and I think all of that was definitely in my thinking as I was working on it, because it had to feel like a period score in places, but through the eyes of now. So you were playing that game.
Yeah, and I also noticed, purely, I think, again, another Anoraki moment, I think I noticed a couple of Shaun of the Dead references in there. Bizarrely.
Oh, well, that I wouldn't.
It was the weirdest thing. I only noticed it the second time round last night, and it's literally in the first 5 minutes, and she comes down the stairs to get the letter, and she skids on the floor, and you get the skid, and I'm like, and immediately I was like, that's Shaun of the Dead. And
okay. I hadn't clocked that one.
I literally, it came to me. I'm sitting there going like that, and I said to my wife, and she was just like, you're mad. And I'm like, that's absolutely fine. Right, Stephen, I've got one more question, and I will leave you to your evening, and so on and so forth. And you've sort of answered it, but I'd like you to expand upon it, really. So having lived, as I spoke to you a year ago, and you were literally finishing off the score then, having lived, I would say, inside this film now for as long as you have, and knowing Edgar as well as you do, how do you believe this marks an evolution in terms of his process, or in terms of himself as a filmmaker?
Well, in terms of him as a filmmaker, as I said earlier, it's like, it's just exciting to me that he's, every film is so different, and whenever he calls up about a film, it's just an exciting thing, because you're off on this journey of, you don't really know where it's going to take you. He often has a really clear idea of where he's going, and he kind of guides us all through it. So that's exciting. And in terms of his evolution, great, you know, this is so different. It opens so many doors stylistically. I think there's some incredible cinematic moments in this film, you know, and fantastic. What next? And in terms of the continued relationship working on those things, it gets, with each film you've got this combined language, you know, and so, you know, an example being I would never hand bits of music over so early to any director other than Edgar, but to play him something that I just sketched one night in a kind of reading the script and responding to that and being able to send that as part of the conversation, and this open thing where you're very happy to see what he makes of it and how he might use it. It means that you get to a really interesting place a lot quicker, because you've got this confidence of working with someone who you trust cinematically and are excited by what their response is going to be and how they're going to inspire you to do something else.